So thank you, Jose, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting us to participate, and you for being here today. I'm going to present today on behalf of my two co-authors. One of them, Lucia, is here with me. And I think by way of introduction, I want to say that this research started as a chapter of a report entitled No Data, No Story, as an attempt to stress and highlight the issue of lack of data for indigenous peoples in the Philippines. And this is an effort to basically raise that profile of evidence and data to inform better policy making. So I'm going to tell the whole story in the next 3 slides. If you want to continue listening to me, you can, otherwise you can fall asleep, whatever you want. The objective of the analysis was to unpack the links between conflict, land, and indigenous peoples in 3 regions of Mindanao, FARC, Caquetá, and Davao. And I'll explain in a minute why these 3 regions in particular. The second objective was to understand better the extent to which format titling, the CADs, certificates of ancestral domain titles, are related or associated with conflict in this part of the world. Our contributions of the paper was to, first of all, create a database that brought together different pieces of data that were released about that time, a couple of years ago. Data on conflict for International Conflict Alert, data on IP presence at the barangay level from the census, the 2020 census, and then geo-reference data from on titles, ancestral titles, from the National Commission of IPs in the Philippines. So that was the first objective: create that database, integrated database. The second one was to quantitatively test the relationship between, again, conflict, IP presence, and titling, and add to the evidence that already existed in the Philippines, which I have to say is scant and also basically qualitative. So we wanted to add to that evidence. And the third one is also to not only understand the links between titles and conflict, but to unpack even further that relationship and understand better how different stages of the tactic process affect conflict. And I explain that in a minute. Our key messages, basically 4 or 5 ideas. The first one is that we took advantage of an unprecedented availability of data in the Philippines. We couldn't have done this analysis 3 or 4 years ago because we didn't have the census data, we didn't have the international conflict alert data on conflict. But even though it was unprecedented, it was also quite incomplete. We call this an incomplete data puzzle. Our second message is that more indigenous population presence is not associated with more conflict, actually with less conflict. And this is different from the evidence we have from US, Canada, and Australia. And I'll come back to that in the discussion. Now we're looking inside these CATS areas, the areas with ancestral domains for IPs. We're looking inside those areas, is more likely to find land-related conflict than non-land related conflict. We also find evidence, and this evidence is weak, but it's still evidence, but there is rigorous evidence, that whether the title is just approved or approved and awarded, you really make a difference on the impact on the association, I'd rather say, on conflict. And finally, our policy headline is that it's not about providing more titles as is, but it's about improving the process in which these titles are provided. So that's basically the story. I'm going to give you all the detail now, but these are our contributions and messages. So, sorry for the awful slides. I don't think I have to in this forum really go into detail about the benefits of titling, but the starting point, of course, is that we know we have plenty of evidence globally across different contexts that land titling have all kind of positive developmental impacts. Evidence shows that increases or can potentially increase physical and human capital, incomes and consumption, reduce poverty, improve access to land, and also reduce gender gaps. We also have evidence that titling allows taxes to be raised, providing more and better government services, and also can contribute to political stability. There is evidence from Colombia in particular that shows that. And also there are other studies that show that titling can have also environmental benefits, including decreased deforestation. In the Philippines, we didn't find that sort of compelling, comprehensive evidence of positive developmental outcomes. What we found was a number of case studies that were concerned about the implementation of the titling process. We found different studies that sort of made the point that granting ancestral rights was not associated automatically with reduced conflict in these areas. It didn't lead to social justice. It didn't lead necessarily to an improved use of sustainable resources. And it didn't necessarily also improve land security, land tenure security, especially in areas with mining industries around. And these same studies also pointing out to the process itself of titling. It shows that the process was cumbersome, tedious, intimidating, and unclear, especially among IP populations. So what data we work with? Basically, we have, I mentioned before, 3 sources. One is the georeference data on CATS, ancestral domains. We have one for Barn, 33 for Caraga, and 38 in Davao. We have also the second database was on violent incidents, about 50,000 observation for the period 2011 to 2020. But it was complete for 2 of these regions, Davao and Caraga. Sorry, it was only for Barn, the complete coverage for the years, and it was only for 2011 to 2015 for Davao and Caraga. So there were a number of years for which these 2 regions, Davao and Caraga, didn't have information of incidents. And the third source was the census, so we could have IP population counts by barangay. We have privileged access to that information before the census was released. So joining the 3 data sources, we just come up with about 41,000 observations at the barangay level, bringing together again the location of cats, the violent incidents, and the IP counts. This is what our data puzzles looks like. Exactly what I said before, but just graphically. For conflict, we have only one region with all the information for 2011 to 2020. We have information, geographic information for cats, actually going way back to 1011, but at least from our period of reference, 2010 to 2020. Information of IP from the census, we have 2010 and 2020, and some other information from the census on administration of the barangays, infrastructure of the barangays, also coming from the census for 2020. So what we did a couple of things at a very basic level, at the descriptive level, sort of ran the correlation, understanding the correlation association between IP presence and violent crime at the barangay. We categorize incidents in areas across barangays with no presence, high presence of IPs, high and low, basically above below average, which are different things. Also looking at quintiles of incidents of IPs, it doesn't change the results. We also categorize our incidents as land related or non-land related. And then we use the information, the georeference information and overlap maps of cats with IP presence and conflicts. And finally, we ran a very simple econometric model, just trying to understand how the location of the incident affected the probability of observing land or non-land cases. I'm not going to go into the detail, just to give you a flavor of the things we got. I just want to call your attention to the right-hand side graphs. The first one is the distribution of violent incidents by province. 40% of the incidents happen in Davao. I remember this is still with a sample that doesn't cover the second half of the period for that region. So there is a concentration of incidents. The other point I want to mention is that in the bottom graph, about 40% of cases we have are undetermined. So we cannot determine whether they are land related or not land related. And that's going to create a bit of a noise in our analysis, you can imagine. The information we have shows that incidents have been decreasing over time. But again, part of the story, a great deal of the story is that we have a chance of data that is not captured. So looking at the descriptive analysis, what we find that barangays with higher presence of IPs are those with a lower level of violence. We have a declining linear trend connecting incidents and IP presence. We also find that land-related and resource-related conflicts are more likely to take place in areas with low IP concentration. You can see the blue bar is no presence of IPs. We have a number of barangays reporting, according to the census, no IP presence at all. And you can see that when you go to no presence to from no presence to low presence, there's an increase in violent cases, but then it declines when you go from low to high presence. This is for land. This is also take place with non-land related cases and also for undetermined cases. Very quickly on the econometric model, we wanted again to understand what is, of course, the association of being inside a CAD area, and then what is the stage of the process you are on observing a conflict. So that's the idea. Unfortunately, what we have is 40,000 observations on incidents of violence incidents, which we can understand. We can know where exactly they happen, which barangay they happen, when they happen. So we can control by province and year, but we are working with a sample of conflicts that are already reported and have sufficient information that we can determine whether they are land or non-land. So the probability we're looking at is not the probability we really want to look at, which is how inside CADs is associated with observing conflict, but conditional of having observed conflict and having sufficient information to determine whether they are land or non-land related, and how these CADs relate to that probability. So it's a narrower probability of what we wanted to start with. So the result we have is something like this. We have different estimations, of course, and a lot of frequency checks. But this is the kind of estimate we get. We find that CADs, being inside a CAD, increases the probability of land-related conflict. It is again controlled by time and fixed effects and geographic effects. It's not statistically significant. We try also approved and awarded and find that approved titles. So these are those that have already started the process in a way, but haven't been fully awarded. Actually, can take years in the Philippines to go from approved to awarded. And we see that, again, the first estimate is positive, the second is negative, but again, it's not statistically significant. And there can be many reasons, again, why it's not statistically significant. One is that the probability we're looking is quite narrow. The other one is that our sample is quite small, because again, we're just getting rid of, we're getting rid of those undetermined cases. So we try a number of things. So we try to the first column to the left is looking basically at all the information we have, whether we can identify them as land, as non-land related, and unidentified. So we increase the number of observations, and we see that then we start. We get statistically significant results. Unfortunately, we're looking at other probabilities. We're looking here at the probability of conditional to observing a violent incident, whether we can determine the cause or we cannot determine the cause. The second column is the second panel is telling us is looking at the entire sample. So we now not only look at, I didn't mention that before, apologies. Before the previous slide was looking at only 2011 to 2015 for everyone. Now here we're looking in the middle column, we're looking at 2011 to 2015 for Caraga Davao, but then we're extending, also taking the years from Barn, going from 2016 to 2020. So we have, here is the entire sample of identified and determined cases. And you can see here now that our sample bigger now produces a statistically significant result. And again, confirms that increases the probability of being inside a CAC, increases the probability of land, and reduces the probability of non-land. We also do other robustness checks in a way to check for endogeneity, trying to see the connection of whether past conflict affects the presence of IPs in the future in different barangays. And you can see that our coefficients and our significance has changed when we introduce as another control population, IP population in 2020, in 2010, before the incidents on conflict that we're measuring, whether it affects the significance and the signs, and it doesn't affect our initial coefficients, the first row. The second and third rows just add to the original estimates another control for log population of IPs in 2010. And the third one, that's the same with a quadratic form, and doesn't change anything. So just to conclude, our key messages again, our policy implication is that more presence of IPs in the Philippines is not a synonym of increased conflict. It is a synonym of increased poverty, but not conflict. CATs are great instruments on paper. We already know that titling is property rights are good for conflict and poverty reduction. But in practice, especially in the Philippines, the design and implementation gets in its way. We have a lengthy process, they're complex, not well understood, and that has implication for conflict. Instead of solving it, you might rekindle it. We also acknowledge that our results are weak, given data, the limitations of our data and our methods. But then we're clear that more, it's not only about more capacities, but how they're implemented matters. And we conclude with the point that just adding more capacity will likely reduce land conflicts, especially in these in areas where IPs are present. Thank you very much.
That was very generous on time. We have 10 minutes for questions for discussions. Yes, please.
Jose, very interesting your research. I wanted to ask you something in geographical terms. What is it a polygon? Because I am thinking about if you can use regression discontinuity to causally to estimate causally the effect of these CATs on conflict. Because what I am thinking is that maybe this border of the CAT, which is a polygon, is almost random. So those households just inside and just outside this cats polygons are very similar, and the only thing that changes is that they are inside or outside the cat. And in that way, you can estimate causally the effect of the cat on other socioeconomic variables if the assumption of the border being randomly assigned is true. I don't know.
Should I answer or take more questions?
I think you can answer one by one.
Okay. So we thought about that, but we don't think that the cats are randomly designed. I think we have, up here these to show that cats are just concentrated in some particular parts of the region, and it has to do as well. These are ancestral domain sort of areas where traditional the presence of IPs are sort of larger. So I don't think we can say that the borders are just random. If I understand your point correctly. So I think mechanically we can try it, but I think in terms of historically and socially, I don't think they're random. Fia, you want to add?
But it's true that the method would work if we knew. No. I think like it's an ancestral land, so probably there's a lot of where the places are located, and it's not random where they are, like the houses and where the towns are built. So we have to look at.
I think mechanically we can do it, but I don't think that all that is random.
Yeah, because I am thinking that maybe being outside the cat, but just for
You mean that
100
the house
meters.
is outside the cat?
Yes, and a household which is outside the cat, but is outside just for 100 meters.
Okay, sorry.
It's almost.
I misunderstood that the border of the cat was random.
The border.
Yeah, but because
It's the presence of the household within.
yes, if the border of the cat is almost random, what I mean is, for example, if we compare two households, one is outside but just 100 meters outside, and the other one is inside but just 100 meters inside.
Yeah.
Maybe they are very similar. And the only difference is that one is just inside and the other one is outside. If they are similar, you can estimate the causal effect of this cat on socioeconomic variables, if this assumption is compliant.
We need to check that. We will need to check that. We have information on sort of economic infrastructure. How different houses are from hospitals or roads and all that, to see whether the presence is random or not, because it may be affected by how close we are to hospitals. So that we can check, and mechanically we can do.
What we have in the maps are where conflicts are. So we have the information. What I'm not sure is that we have the census map. We have the conflict data map. So we need to check.
So can you add a quick clarification? So when you mentioned the separate, when you talk about IPs and you say approved, awarded, so are these at what level? So is it at the level of I don't remember the name, the municipality, the interventions? Yes. So so this municipality is, they go there and say, okay, we're gonna. So are you able to do any before-after analysis? So to compare conflict levels before and after and then you can match municipality based on observables or.
Unfortunately not. So we have the georeference of where the cat stands geographically, spatially, which can be within a barangay district. Can take 2 barangays, or can be half of a barangay. So
This is not a very good. So you cannot say here in 2016 is okay.
no.
But
Ideally, the next thing we would like to do is to see the length of between awarded and approved.
yes, that was my second point, because that's the key message is the complexity of the process that might frustrate.
Yeah.
I imagine that, going through the process, you trigger this idea of this is my land, and this start the dispute, and the longer it takes to okay.
There are so many things we would like to do,
yes.
but we can't because of the data. We have some limitation with also the methodology, but the data in itself doesn't allow to do that many things.
More questions? I maybe would like to ask you if in this data set of violent incidents there is sort of other dimensions beyond land or non-land conflict. If you can sort of tell apart forced displacement, for example, or types of violence, just to understand who is.
We have here different the different types of conflict, and determining common crimes, shadow economies, identity issues, political issues, resource issues, governance issues. We have also what we have in those go through. Sorry. In the other part, in economy, administration, infrastructure, we have one variable which is whether the barangay has centers for displaced population, for instance. We actually play around with that one. That one is, however, for 2020. Our data is for 2011 to 2015. So we play with that. Again, it doesn't make so much sense with the data.
Mike also was, can you exploit the number of conflict, or you just have a 0-1? Also, maybe you sometimes in conflict they might use like a Poisson type of count.
We use that for the descriptives, but we haven't done that for the cosmetics. We can definitely try that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now we have Deborah Pierce from CIAT. We'll be talking about land in Colombia.
No, I don't think this. No.
Okay, that's fine.
No, this shouldn't be visible.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here. My name is Debbie Pierce. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia in Canada and a visiting researcher at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT in Cali, Colombia. And today I am presenting on behalf of my my co-authors who couldn't be here. And we'll be presenting on our research on markets, land use, and conflicts, the impact of the peace agreement on land markets, a case study of Caquetá, Colombia. So I wanted to start with some general context about Colombia. So Colombia, for those of you who aren't familiar, is in northern South America. It's one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. And it has a significant portion of the Amazon forest, but it also experienced one of the longest civil conflicts in the Western Hemisphere, which officially ended, at least between the FARC, which was the largest guerrilla group in the country, and the government of Colombia. And this conflict ended on September 24th of 2016, and ended more than 50 years of conflict in the country. We'll be focusing on the Department of Caquetá, which was one of the areas of the country that was especially heavily impacted by the conflict. Parts of Caquetá were controlled by the FARC for several decades. And so it experienced much higher conflict levels than many other parts of the country. The economy of Caquetá is also driven by cattle ranching. So it experienced a lot of deforestation through different waves of colonization, mostly by Colombians in other parts of the country that were fleeing from conflict in their own regions. So this cattle grazing really caused a lot of deforestation in the country. But we've also seen a more recent wave of deforestation since the armed conflict. So this is something that I think a lot of research is really trying to understand. So I just wanted to show this picture for some context. This is an example of some of the extensive cattle grazing in the western part of Caquetá, which is kind of the transition between the Andes Mountains and the Amazon forest, which is where most of the population of Caquetá lives. So as you can see, most of the native vegetation here has been deforested. The only remaining patches are these little wetland areas that are really hard to deforest for cattle. So some background on the conflict as well, and how the conflict impacts land use and decision makers among small farmers. We think, and it has been kind of initially proven, that the conflict does, or at least the ending of the conflict does offer some new possibilities for small producers and landowners in Caquetá in terms of possibly improvements in investment opportunities, changing land use priorities, and other kind of other aspects of daily life that may be impacted. Because it's important to note that the conflict in this part of Colombia really did impact the daily lives of Caqueteños. The FARC limited movement, so many people were limited in where they could sell their products, where they could move to, who they could talk to, what they could grow. So there were really many aspects of their lives that were impacted. And until now, there has been little evidence on the relationship between conflict and land markets. So what we're interested in understanding is how this changing conflict and the waning of the conflict has impacted land markets in this part of Colombia. Most of the literature so far has been more qualitative in nature, which is definitely a crucial part of this, and we also have some qualitative aspects of this work, but we were really hoping to collect more quantitative information on the frequency of land transactions and land prices over time and how conflict affected these. We're also interested in looking at the impact of the conflict on deforestation. I think this has been a more heavily researched area, but looking kind of at the link between both land markets, land use decisions, deforestation, and conflict has kind of been a missing link so far. So we're really interested in looking beyond what I think so far has been explained as a political problem and seeing how land markets are impacting land use. So our research question here is, what is the relationship between conflict, land transactions, land use, and land prices? And specifically, what is the impact of the peace agreement in 2016 on land markets in conflict zones that were especially heavy in years prior to the peace agreement? So our objectives here are to measure the impact of the peace agreement in terms of, to start, the number of transactions and deforestation rates. So prices is something that we're going to get into a bit later. Our hypothesis, obviously conflict is a very complicated topic that will impact land markets and decisions of individual landowners in many different ways, but we wanted to attempt to simplify it here a bit more in two different ways. So first, we hypothesized that more conflict would lead to a larger quantity of land transactions, at least while the conflict is happening. So in areas that are closer to conflict events and experience more conflict, we expected these people to want to sell their land more often than in areas with more peace. Our second hypothesis was that more conflict would lead to lower land prices. And I think the idea here is that if people are experiencing conflict, they're going to want to leave more quickly and are going to be less concerned about the price that they sell their land at. So these were our two hypotheses to start with. The identification strategy of the farms that we looked at here, we worked with 125 farms and 139 parcels. So farms can be made up of more than one parcel. And we looked at these farms before and after the signing of the peace agreement. So our treatment farms were the farms that were located within a 10-kilometer radius where the number of fatal victims due to the FARC specifically were higher than the departmental average. And our control farms were located within a 10-kilometer radius where the number of fatal victims was lower than the departmental average. I hope that makes sense. And overall, the historic average of fatal victims in the department over the span of the entire conflict was 67 people in that 10-kilometer radius area. So to show the farms we were working with graphically, that right there in the left-hand corner is a map of Caquetá. So we're working in the municipalities close to the Andes Mountains there. And the farms in black are our treatment farms. So those were the farms that were closer to conflict events, whereas the farms in gray were our control farms. So a lot of the conflict was more concentrated in the municipalities of Albania, Puerto Milan, La Montanita, Donceo, y that other one right there is, I think that's San Vicente del Cabuan. So that just shows some of the examples. All right, so our data was at 2 different levels. Like I said, there were 125 farms that we identified. We georeferenced the location of each. And overall, there were 139 parcels. So a few farms had more than one parcel. Overall, there were 11,675 transactions recorded. This data spans from 1950 to 2023, so quite an extensive data set. And transactions here include things like sales, inheritances, and just giving land away occasionally. So occasionally there was no price recorded. Our data on conflict came from the National Center on Historic Memory from the government of Colombia. So they're collecting data around the conflict in general and trying to really have specific data on who is perpetrating what, when it occurred, where it occurred, what was the type of conflict. So to start, we only looked at the exact coordinates of where these conflicts were occurring, and we only looked at fatal victims. And we included data from 1940 until 2023. And actually, this conflict data does end in 2016 because the FARC demobilized in 2016. So our conflict data is only up until the signing of the peace agreement. Our data on land transactions came from certificates of tradition and freedom. These were from 1950 to 2023. I will also note that there is a very high level of informal land ownership in this region of Colombia. So the farms here are not necessarily representative of the entire department because these are only parcels that have been formally titled since 1950. So that makes them in the slight minority of parcels in this region of Colombia. And then in terms of deforestation data, we used Global Forest Watch data from 2001 to 2021. So our results, using a difference in difference method, showed that transactions were actually statistically significant and did decrease in farms that experienced conflict following the peace agreement. So they decreased, I think, on average by about 19% following the peace agreement. Our data on deforestation showed that there was a slight increase in these farms following the peace agreement, which is consistent with the data, but our results were not statistically significant here. We also decided to look at farms within different distances from conflict. So we looked at 5 kilometers, 7.5, 12.5, 15, 17.5, and up to 20 kilometers. And we did see that anything less than 10 kilometers was statistically significant and increasingly important in terms of the number of transactions. And we also saw that anything more than 10 kilometers was not statistically significant. So that helped justify our methods. We also decided to look at other types of conflict. So we looked at combat actions, which could have been done by the FARC or the government of Colombia. We looked at selective assassinations, mine victims, and kidnappings. And we found that all of these types of conflict had an impact, but especially combat actions and selective assassinations. Mine victims also did decrease or increase the number of transactions more than any other, but it was a little less significant. So to conclude, this research is kind of different in the way that it analyzes a large data set of transactions in relation to the conflict. It's a quantitative piece of research and a mostly qualitative branch of literature. And it also includes an empirical strategy to solve the problem of conflict endogeneity. So to conclude, we did find that transactions decreased in farms that were closer to conflict events following the peace agreement, but we saw very little impact on deforestation. I also wanted to add, while we didn't find any major impact on deforestation rates, we did see a higher rate of participation of treatment farms in conservation programs following the peace deal. So this is an anecdotal piece of evidence that we're hoping to follow up on more. But a lot of these farms were beginning to be involved with things like PES schemes or reforestation schemes. So for some future work, we're hoping to include other measurements of conflict, because I think including perceived conflict is a really important component here, especially when it comes to individual decision making. So that's a bit more qualitative, but that data is being collected currently. We're also hoping to look beyond deforestation. I think the limitations here, the peace deal was relatively recent in terms of deforestation impacts, but we'd also like to look at reforestation and other types of land use, even types of farming practices, things like silvopastoral systems being put in place, agroforestry systems, kind of these different types of investments in farms is a really interesting component of the conflicts that I think is just starting to be understood. And it's a bit harder to capture than just deforestation data. And I think that also gets to the last point, that we want to understand kind of these historic land use changes over time and how they relate to the conflict. Because we know that the conflict had a really strong impact on land use decisions and controlled a lot about how farmers were making land use decisions on their farms. So leave you with a picture of Caquetá. On the left here is a picture of a silvopastoral system that's been put in place recently, and on the right is some freshwater aquaculture. So we are starting to see some more of these alternative livelihood strategies in this part of the region following the end of the conflict, and that it's not, fully dominated by cattle grazing anymore necessarily. With that, I will leave it. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thank you, Ari. Questions?
Thanks so much. So Robert Hellmeyer, UC Santa Barbara. I'm curious, I'm trying to wrap my head around treatment here, and specifically what SUPA violations I should think about, or kind of how regional effects might come into play. And so I'm curious if you can just describe kind of the broad trends in land transactions that have happened since the peace deal. Is there a reason we'd expect the effect to really be concentrated in these micro conflict zones, or if there's kind of regional changes to land markets that are happening as a result of the peace deal?
That's a good question. I haven't heard about too many trends. I will say, so there are other things going on here. I think a lot of land sales, there were new buyers that came in after the peace deal, new buyers from other parts of Colombia, new buyers internationally. And so I think there was a bit of a land rush at that time. So that may have, and that's also other people's perception of conflict. So it gets to be a bit broader than just the landowner making a decision one way or the other. So I think that's a really good point. And I think that we need to look into these broader trends. Of course, it's hard. Like I said, a lot of this land, not the farms we studied, but a lot of the land in Caquetá is informally owned. Yet there are still land transactions occurring. So looking at that dynamic, I think, is a missing piece of this research that we need to look into more.
Okay, so yeah, so for me it's a clarification. So can you tell me again how you construct your control group? You said 10 kilometers from?
So the control farms are located within a 10-kilometer radius of areas that had a lower than average conflict rate, if that makes sense.
Okay, so but the center of this area.
It doesn't. The center doesn't really necessarily matter. It's
Okay.
just this 10-kilometer
so
area.
No, okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so okay. So my question then is, so okay, I understand the rationale for selling the land, but who is buying this land?
It's a good question. I don't think we have a good answer for that.
Okay.
I mean, we have names, but we don't know where they're coming from. We don't know if they're
concentration of land in the hands of fewer farmers.
That's, I mean, another really important point that we don't have a good sense
because
of.
that could have implication for what they end up doing.
Definitely.
With it after.
Yeah. Yeah, Anna.
So Debbie, how does this fit into like the broader? Because when I hear about like conflict and land transactions, a lot of what I think about is how there was a lot of land consolidation during this time. Like a lot of paramilitaries took the opportunity to just take all these lands, put extensive cattle ranching on it. So how does this story kind of fit in with that narrative? And like, what are other narratives that you're hearing?
Yeah, so my impression of that is a lot of that land was coming from untitled land. And so this land, I mean, I'm sure the same thing could be happening with these farms, and we just don't have a very good way of tracking that. But yeah, I think this region of Caquetá is pretty, compared to the rest of the region, it's relatively dense in terms of population, and it's a bit closer to markets, roads, population centers. And so I think a lot of the land consolidation that was happening in the region was happening a bit further out. So it was a bit more remote and a bit harder to monitor by, formal entities. But I mean, it would be really interesting if we could get at this issue of land concentration and figure out who is buying the land. Definitely.
Two quick questions. One kind of jumping on the super-related question earlier. Do your results look similar if instead of using like the 50th percentiles at cutoff points, you say take the upper and lower terciles or quartiles as your treatment groups? Because then you're adding a little bit of distinction between these two groups, and I feel like there might be some pushback that there's not really a meaningful discontinuity at 50th percentile, so maybe adding a little bit more data between them would be helpful. But also, I think the one interesting question here is you talk a lot about how you're looking at a subsection here for formally registered land, informally registered land, but within formally registered land, kind of the prices are decreasing as conflict happens. So that might be one way of kind of quickly getting out of the market if you're really worried about kind of the conflicts. But you could also imagine people would switch to more informal sales if they don't have time to find documentation. So do you think you're getting kind of a complete picture of these sales?
No, definitely not. And that's one of the data limitations in working in this area, is that so many of these land sales are happening in a way that we can't track. So if that is the case, maybe there isn't an impact on price here, and maybe it is happening through informal land sales. I mean, that's completely possible, especially because the people who informally own their land are going to be even more vulnerable to the conflict than people who formally own it. So that's a very good point. In terms of the 50th, that kind of like breakdown of treatment and control, I think that's a good point. We did look at different distances. I can go back to that slide real quick. Different distances here. So this kind of breaks it down a bit more, and we're just looking at, instead of just treatment and control, we're just looking at distance of farm kind of from the conflict. So I think, this kind of reinforced at least using 10 kilometers, but I think your point is well taken, and I will definitely relay that to my colleagues.
Here's a question for you. I think it's
pretty much related to what was already asked, but I was just thinking about what's the role of forced displacement in this context? Because there's a lot of research for other parts of Colombia that this is a major issue.
Yeah,
definitely. So I was just wondering whether it could be a channel also in your context. I don't know whether there is data on forced displacement, but I'm not sure at what level.
Yeah, I mean, we do have conflict data on forced displacement. I don't know how accurate it is, but it is there, and I'm sure it's being improved all the time. But I would guess that a lot of these land sales are forced displacements. I'm sure that that's happening, and it's hard to disentangle that from the data that we have. But it would be really great if we could figure out a way to do that. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is related to clarification about how many years before the treatment you have and how many years after the treatment you have. And I am asking this because I was surprised about your results on combats. Normally, I should have expected a different result that with the peace agreement. Well, it can also be an increase in the number of combats because of the dissidents of the FARC, because of the paramilitaries. So the sign could be negative or could be positive. And that's why I'm asking about the number of years after the treatment and before the treatment. And the other is more like a suggestion about land use. You can also use the location of coca crops that exists from 2000 and is currently done by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And they have exact coordinates of coca crops. So you can also check what has happened with the peace agreement in these farms related to or regarding this problem of coca cultivation.
And they have that data until this year, last year?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's your reference data, the exact location of the coca crop. And the information is publicly available.
Okay, great. That's great to know. Thank you. Your question about the length of time before and after. So that's another, I'd say, limitation of this work is that we have a lot more data before the peace agreement in terms of transactions or in terms of conflict?
Both.
Okay, so in terms of transactions, I think we covered from 1940 to 2023. Okay. So obviously, that's a lot more years before. Mm-hmm. But it's what we could do, and we wanted to be as robust with the data before the peace agreement as we could. But obviously, those, the situation is dynamic following the peace agreement. So I think it could change a lot in the following years. And considering it's only been 7-8 years since the peace agreement, that's really, the data's not totally easy to compare. And in terms of the conflict events, I think this is one limitation as well. So because the FARC demobilized, anything attributed to the FARC in the conflict data, as far as I'm aware, is zero following the peace agreement. If it's a FARC dissident, I don't think that conflict would be attributed to the FARC in our data set. So we're assuming that the conflict events have ceased following the peace agreement. And I know that that's not the case. So I think including that and taking that into consideration in terms of how that's affecting transactions currently would be another kind of important piece to look at. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have two questions, if you don't mind.
Of course.
If you're very interested in this topic, I just have two clarification questions. First is, how did you pick the plots inside each of the treatment and control groups? Because it's a sample of plots, right? It's not all plots. So what was the criteria to select them? And the second one is, I'm not sure if I understood, but do you have results in land prices? Prices?
No, no, we're still working. But yeah, in terms of our sample, they were randomly selected in the regions of Caquetá, close to so only a certain number of municipalities kind of close to the Andes Mountains.
But out of a list of all the plots that have sort of a certificate,
Yeah,
you just
exactly.
pick that random.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
And now for our last presentation, Anderson Tamipatini is going to present on another sadly very Colombian practice, which is forced eradication of illicit crops.
Okay, thank you for being here. My name is Anderson Tamipatino. I'm from Colombia, and this is a paper that I am working with Daniela Horta Science, which is about the impact of forced eradication of illicit crops on human capital. Especially, I'm going to talk about the aerial spraying policy in Colombia and how it affected human capital accumulation and other socioeconomic conditions of Colombian people affected by this policy. We first wanted to study this, the topic of illicit economies, because there is a strong link between illicit economies with bad processes of violence, insecurity, deforestation, corruption, and political instability. But at the same time, those governments or some governments have tried to implement some policies as solutions that try to break the negative feedback loop. But whether these policies have worked is very doubtful. Now talking about one of the policies that try to decrease the level of illicit economies, in this case, cultivation of illicit crops, is eradication of illicit crops, which has been implemented in Colombia at the national level, but it has also been discussed in other countries, for example, Peru, Mexico, and Afghanistan, and maybe not policies similar to what Colombia has implemented, but they are still policies that try to decrease the level of cultivation of illicit crops. So that's why we wanted to know what was the effect of this policy on the people that were supposed to be benefited from these policies. Because one of the arguments that Colombia, with the support of the United States, have made is that by decreasing cultivation of illicit crops, illegal armed groups are not going to be as strong as they are. Therefore, people in these areas are going to be benefited. Their living conditions are going to improve. And we wanted to test if this is the case. So our research question is, does forced eradication affects human capital and socioeconomic outcomes? We investigate this question in the case of Colombia, because Colombia became the most important producer of coca in the 90s. Coca is an illicit crop because it is the main input to produce cocaine, and it became the most important cocaine producer in the 80s, at least the cocaine that was coming to the United States. And that's why Colombia, with the support of the United States, decided to implement a policy in 1994, which is the use of airplanes to spray a herbicide, which is called glyphosate. In the case of Colombia, that has been the most important policy to try to decrease the level of cultivation of this crop. And how we answer this question? We answer by georeferencing some maps produced by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Colombia that were published between 2004 and 2015. We combine the location of these areas that were sprayed with the location of schools and information at the school level about dropout, students who fail. And we also use the 2018 population census that has also the geographic coordinates of the approximate location of the houses. And we implement a sharp regression discontinuity strategy to causally identify the effects of this policy on human capital accumulation and socioeconomic impacts in the medium run. What are some of the results that we have? First, for this policy, diminished human capital accumulation and educational performance in the short term. This is not a new research question, but that's why we also wanted to explain some of the mechanisms behind these results. And one the main mechanism that we found is a substantial negative income shock. And another thing that we are also contributing to the literature is that we are also analyzing if there are persistent effects after the policy stopped. Well, I'm going to explain the institutional background, the data. I'm going to explain the research design, the results in the short run, the results in the medium run, and finally, the conclusions. Coca is a plant that has been traditionally used by indigenous communities in the Andean countries, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, but it was considered illegal because it is the main input to produce cocaine. And Colombia is the only country that has implemented this policy at the national level. I mean, for example, Mexico has also used airplanes to spray this herbicide. But in the case of Mexico, this is not a national policy. The only country that has implemented this policy at the national level is Colombia. This policy started in 1994, and it stopped in 2015. And it stopped in this year because there was a bad review from the World Health Organization that found that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic. Therefore, the Ministry of Health in that time suggested to the President, Juan Manuel Santos, to stop using this policy. And its day-to-day implementation depended on weather conditions, wind speed, probability of rain. It also depended on other factors, presence of illegal armed groups that can shoot the airplanes. And the most important criteria of the implementation of this policy was that the area had to have coca crops. The coca density was the main criteria. So this is what we have done. So you see here one of the examples of the maps that were published by the United Nations Office. This is the case of the report published in 2012. We have the exact maps from 2004 to 2015 in the case of aerial spraying. And you can see that there are red areas. These are the areas that we georeference. So we got the exact coordinates of the areas that were sprayed. We also do the same with the areas that were manually eradicated. Manual eradication is another policy. In this case, these maps were published between 2006 and 2015. The next thing that we do is that we combine these, the coordinates of these areas that were sprayed with the location of schools and with information of schools about the number of students who drop out, who failed, who were transferred to other schools. This is information at the school level. And from this analysis, we got the results in the short term. In the medium run, we use the 2018 population census that has one variable which is called the rural section. You are going to see it later, which is the approximate location of the house. The Department of Statistics, they don't show the exact location of the households, but they publicly say what is the approximate location of these houses. So this is what we have. done. So here you see the example of an area that was sprayed in 2004, in 2005. The area that was sprayed is in yellow, that we obtained by using this technique. And you can also see the red points, which is the location of schools. And if you compare 2004 to 2005, you can see that the location of schools is the same. The only thing that changed is the area that was sprayed. Is the only thing that changed. So we have done this for every year from 2004 to 2015. Therefore, what we are claiming here is that if we compare those schools that are just outside the area that was sprayed and the schools that are just inside that inside the areas that were sprayed, we are making a very good comparison. The only difference between these schools is that some of them were sprayed and other ones were not. And we do the same when we use the 2018 census. Here you can see again the areas that were sprayed in Colombia. There you see the points are the centroids of the rural sections, which is the approximate location of the households. The only difference between between what we are doing here with the approximate location of households and what we did before with the location of schools is that in this case, we are not using those rural sections that were partially eradicated. So we are only comparing those rural sections that were totally inside the area that was sprayed against those rural sections that were totally outside the area that was sprayed. So in terms of an equation, what we have implemented is a regression discontinuity design in which erad-IT is the dummy that indicates whether the school or the rural section is inside the area that was sprayed, and distance is the distance between the school and the closest part of the border of this area that was sprayed, or the distance between the center of the rural section and the closest part of the border that was sprayed. So I have many results because from the school census we have a bunch of information. From the 2018 household census we also have a bunch of information. I can talk about them if you are interested in the last part. But here, what I wanted to show is that if we use the school census, these are the results. Those schools that were sprayed, they have a higher dropout rate. They also have a higher rate of students who fail. So there is a negative impact of this policy on educational outcomes. These results are robust to different types of samples. So if we drop schools near the border, or if we change the treatment and control group, the definitions of the treatment and control groups, if we include different geographic controls, if we use a quadratic polynomial, if we use different sample restrictions, and even if the implementation of a difference in difference estimator here is very difficult, we also did a two-way fixed effects estimator, and the coefficients are statistically significant and have the expected sign. Although this is kind of evidence I don't trust very much in the diff estimator, because the main problem is that one school can be in 1 year inside the area, and in the next one is outside, and in the next one is inside, and that is the difficulty of implementing the difference in difference estimator here. What we have also done, which is different to previous papers about this issue, is that we also analyze the possible mechanisms, the channels of this negative educational outcome. First, we show that migration is not one of the channels. Here we don't have information about migration, but we have information about the rate of students who are transferred out of the school. And in fact, those schools that were sprayed, they have a lower rate of students who were transferred out. At first, it was kind of surprising, but at the same time, it's not because maybe they are not transferring to other schools because of the negative income shock. They don't have monetary resources to move to other places. We also found that conflict is not one of the channels. In this case, we computed the number of landmine events around the schools, around 1 kilometer, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers. And we showed that those schools that were sprayed, in fact, have a lower number of landmine events. So this is not one of the mechanisms. Surprisingly, we also analyzed the health shock. Surprisingly, this is not one of the mechanisms. We don't have information of health at the school level. However, in this case, what we have done is a comparison between these results of the aerial spraying program on educational outcomes with the effects of manual eradication on educational outcomes. There are many differences between these two programs, but if there is one difference, which is important, is that manual eradication doesn't have a direct effect on health. So what we done is we expected to see a difference between these two estimations. And if there is a significant difference, then we can say maybe the health mechanism is behind these negative educational outcomes. However, manual eradication has similar effects on educational outcomes. Therefore, we can say that at least there is evidence that health is not one of the mechanisms. I'm going to explain more about this result. What we have found is that there is a negative shock on household income. In this case, we don't have information of income at the school level. However, we use nighttime light as a proxy for economic activity or household income. And we show that those schools that were sprayed, they have a lower nighttime luminosity around 1 kilometer or 5 kilometers. We have done a bunch of changes regarding the radius of this. We wanted to analyze also the median run because we wanted to be sure of the previous results first, and we also wanted to see if these results are persistent in time. So that's why we use the 2018 census, household census, and we got the same story. There is a decrease in the proportion of people that has primary and secondary education. We also have interesting results regarding the labor market of boys and girls. In the case of boys who are 10 to 19 years old, there is an increase in the proportion of these boys who were working. In the case of girls from the same age, there is an increase in the proportion of girls who are doing household chores. Kind of surprising result, or not surprising, but at least important result in the case of Latin America, because this issue is not very studied in our context, but there is a lower proportion of girls and women that remain single, which is also like, it could be a coping mechanism to when there are negative income shocks. Again, there are not health effects. There is no a statistically significant effect on the number of boys or girls who were sick in the last month or who had any type of disability, which kind of confirmed the results that we had in the previous part. And again, the main mechanism is income. Here we don't have information. I don't know why in this households census they don't ask about the income of the household. However, we use as proxy the access to drinkable water or garbage collection, and there is a decrease in the proportion of households that have access to these amenities or utilities. In general, there is not very clear evidence about whether this policy has reduced coca cultivation. We also have made this in this paper. What we have cited other papers too that have found, some of these papers have found that yes, it decreases, others don't find this relationship. But what we are saying is that it has a negative effect on human capital accumulation. The mechanism seems to be a negative income shock at the household level, and these effects seem to be persistent over time because it affects child labor, early marriage, and it decreases the schooling levels in the rural section. Therefore, there must be, when the governments or when the policymakers implement this type of policies, they should think very well about what are going to be the effects on the population. Because I mean, what Daniela and I am saying is that instead of improving the living conditions of these people, no, this policy, what it did is completely the opposite. It decreased the educational outcomes of these households. It affected the income, and it had a persistent effect on time. Thank you very much. This is my presentation.
Thank you. Any questions? So, feel free to take them.
Hi, very cool work. I have two comments. First is if we can think about this spray called, if we should be surprised about not finding health impacts, since like maybe spraying is very different from persistent diseases or other things in agriculture.
In fact, I was surprised about the no effects on health, but I think that the main reason for this is that at this point in this paper, I am doing another paper that I'm going to comment about. In this case, we didn't analyze the type of illness or the type of disease, because maybe in general people are not affected, but it only affects people in a short time for specific diseases. So, for example, in Africa that I am working, which I have to work a lot on this, but I have found is that this policy increases the intoxication by plaguicides, which is one of the results. This effect is persistent, and it also increases the rate of cases of respiratory infections. So that is what I think is happening here. Maybe it's not affecting the health status of the people, but it is affecting with a specific type of illnesses. Yes.
Can I ask a second question?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I was wondering if you have explored, if indeed can have an effect on health, if you have explored the water channel, because I'm thinking about the Diaz, Foch, and Suarez paper on glyphosate use, and they explored like downstream and upstream, because I was thinking that potentially there can be a potential spillover to the areas outside the areas where the eradication takes place if you have the water channel.
No, I haven't explored it. In fact, when I read that paper, I really liked very much that paper, and I was trying to think if it was possible to do something similar But I think that these are the effects that we are explaining. There may be spillover effects, but our argument is that we are finding results even if there are spillovers. So if we can control for this, I think that the effects should be even higher. That is something that we want to explore later, but at this point we have. Thank you.
Thanks, it's super interesting. I was actually just thinking about the causality in the setting. It kind of hinges on the assumption that the locations that were sprayed are completely exogenous to the outcomes that you find, right? But I was just wondering, what if these eradications were actually very targeted at all the areas that were growing coca? So what if what you're actually measuring is the reasons for people to engage in coca cultivation in the first place? Maybe because they are very poor, which would explain also the educational outcomes and so on. So I'm not entirely convinced that it's really super exogenous, the boundary of the areas that were sprayed or not. Maybe they are, but I think it's something that you might want to discuss.
Yeah, no, it's true. But let me go here to the assumptions. Here, what we have done is to show that those schools just outside, let me see, because I don't remember if these are the results at the school or at the rural section level. Let me check. Yes, these are at the school level. So in this case, we have a bunch of characteristics around schools before the implementation of these policies. So for example, in 1993, we have nighttime light, we have the number of landmines, we have also the amount of coca around these schools, whether there was aerial spraying in the previous year or whether there was also manual eradication in the previous year. And there are not statistically significant differences between these schools just inside and outside. The only difference is elevation. And all the results that we have shown, we are controlling for elevation. So this is, yes, we agree with your question, and that's why we have this table. Thank you so much.
But so qualitative, there is coca on both sides of the boundary. It's just that the boundary gets fixed by the government and they spray only on one side. Like there's a continuum of coca crops, or maybe there's not coca in either side, like they only spray on one side of the boundary. Isn't that like that?
Yeah.
Coca.
Our argument is that maybe the only thing that it changes, because this is a decision that the pilot has to make while they are flying. So maybe just outside the area that was sprayed, there is also coca, but the density is not as much as what is happening inside. And that is something that the pilot has only, like, by visualization can make the decision about. Yes.
Two quick questions, or I guess comment. So the first is that it seems like this would be very cumulative effect. And if I understand your strategy right, you're comparing sort of in a year they do a certain amount of spraying, and there's a difference between places inside and outside of that spraying region. But it seems like for a student being in school over a long period of time, like the cumulative year on year spraying would have a big effect. Which would have to maybe move a bit away from the regression discontinuity approach, or it's more like a cumulative treatment.
Yeah, no, and we wanted to ask that question. The problem is that we are not able to do it with the regression discontinuity design. It would be, in this case, this question could be answered with a difference in difference approach. But with the granular information, we cannot do it at this moment. Maybe, but I think that in that case, what we can do is to make an estimation, maybe at the municipality level or something.
So you're measuring these outcomes like in 2018, right? A lot of the education outcomes you said?
At the household level, yes, in 2018, and at the school level in the same year of spring, in the following year of aerial spring. Yes.
So, two quick comments. Well, first, this is I think we all really appreciate how thorough you've been with this paper. But kind of more broadly, I think something that speaks to a lot of the comments that have been raised would be interesting to see just like more qualitative detail about what this aerial spraying is, who's making the decisions, why these areas. You kind of answered some of that qualitatively, so it's clear that you have this knowledge off the top of your head. And I think that'll get a way towards kind of resolving, I think, some of these endogeneity concerns about the exact boundaries, right? I mean, I think your results are robust enough that, like, you could have some violation of exogeneity and your results could still hold. So maybe one thing to do would be think about bounding exercises, right? How violated would exogeneity have to be for your results to disappear? My sense, again, based on the thoroughness, is it would have to be violated a lot. So it sounds like you're the king here. But I still think more qualitative information going in would help. And then just kind of one other kind of my thought here in this whole thing as a political scientist was to think through more of the literature, some of the excellent literature on rebel governance. And particularly, yeah, it makes sense that, if I don't know who's running these schools, right? If these are areas that are largely FARC controlled in the sense that kind of the FARC are running the schools and providing some sense of public goods, and some sets of public goods are being provided by the state. But, it kind of wouldn't be surprising in any other context that if the primary source of tax revenue in an area goes away for a period of time, the local tax revenues are going to decrease, and so local public goods are going to suffer as a result. So I think looking more at funding streams to the schools could either support that mechanism, or you could just, that's potentially a mechanism that could be ruled out through kind of qualitative information about how these institutions are being funded.
Yeah. Regarding some of the characteristics of the schools, here we are using only results on rural and public schools, which is what happens normally in rural areas. It's very uncommon to see a private school in a rural area, as well as yes. So this is one of the characteristics of the result that we have done here. We are also using in some of the results, we have also controlled, for example, the number of students, the total number of students enrolled in a school, whether they have 20 students, whether they have 10 students, 1 student per year or something like that. And the results are also very robust to these other characteristics of the schools. I'm going to include in later more qualitative data about what's going on in rural areas in Colombia and with the schools, and I appreciate your comments.
Yes. Thanks so much. Super important work. I'm curious, so in the motivation, you kind of described why you would think, or why the literature kind of opens up this ambiguous result, right? That there's these potential local livelihood effects, but then maybe more general effects on conflict and institutions and all these other outcomes. And so I'm curious, like, your paper really seems to dive into very effectively the local livelihood effects that spraying will have on production within these landscapes. But it seems to miss, like, if there's a more diffuse change in conflict within a region, then you wouldn't necessarily expect to capture that in the RD. And so I'm curious, like, the final conclusions, it seemed a little bit challenging to then go to, okay, well, this is a net negative for welfare, because you're missing the potential pathways by which it could be benefiting broader communities that have spillovers across both the treated and the untreated communities, if that makes sense. And I think the landmines result kind of hints at that, right? That if you're actually seeing a reduction in landmines within these treated areas, maybe there is some change to kind of aggregate conflict that exists within the whole region. And so I'm just curious what your reflections are. Is that missing some very obvious thing about this context that is important to know why kind of the net benefit of this policy exists?
You know, I think one of the weaknesses of this approach is that we need detailed granular data of schools, conflict, and that's why we use landmark events, because we have the exact coordinates of these events. What we can do is we can try to use these other measures of conflict, try to link the school to a municipality, and by that way use the level of conflict in that municipality. I think that the results are not going to change very much. Maybe there are not going to be statistically significant effects on conflict, and but yes, I agree also that this measure of conflict, yes, there is a problem on trying to think at the very local level, because these are issues that happen in a more regional level. Yes.
My question is, how much spraying you need to eradicate the coca crop?
Sorry?
How much spraying you need? How much? I mean, you have information of spraying. If there is if you are showing that there is an income effect, my question is, when that income effect start to kick off? I mean, how successful you have to be in your spraying to see this effect? Successful in the sense of eradicating the crop. So
yeah, regarding eradication of coca crops, the problem is that glyphosate is not 100% effective, and there are many reasons for that. The one is that this herbicide only affects the leaf, doesn't affect the stem of the coca crop. Therefore, the same coca plant can grow new leaves in 6 months. So that is one reason. The other reason is that coca farmers have tried to avoid this problem by, for example, applying salt to the leaves. So when glyphosate comes to the plant, it doesn't touch the leaves, so it doesn't have any effect. So and even if this herbicide has an effect on the plant, and a strong effect, people can plant another coca plant. So these are, but it doesn't mean that there are no negative effects on income. What we are showing is that, or what the literature or other papers have also shown, is that this policy, it doesn't really decrease coca crops. But what we are showing is that there is a negative income shock that has persistent effects on education. In the case of the results that we have found at the level of schools, is that this effect happens in the year after eradication took place. And when we use the 2018 census, is that this result is also persistent. It doesn't affect only education, but it also affects labor market of children. It also affects early marriage, and it also affects other measures of household income.
Just following up on that, there's a little bit of a puzzle there, right? If you're not affecting the total coca crop that's harvested, but you're seeing these local livelihood effects, then doesn't that by necessity imply that the coca production is then moving to other locations, so you're getting a livelihood benefit to the other communities? Like, I'm trying to think about that aggregate production staying flat while you're seeing these livelihood impacts in the communities that are being sprayed.
Yes, no, it affects the harvesting process, but it doesn't affect as much the cultivation process. And well, when, for example, even if the coca leaf has sold, its value is not as much as a leaf which hasn't been sprayed. So there is a negative effect on the harvesting process, and also in the process of taking this coca leaf to the market. It doesn't affect cultivation because the coca can grow itself, or people can, or coca farmers can cultivate again a coca plant there. But it affects the harvesting process, and it affects when farmers take these leaves to the market.
Last question.
I just wanted to ask if any of these areas that you worked in had other types of coca removal programs in place during any of the times, like the PNIS, like if any of those were kind of working in tandem with the spraying.
Yes, I think that many of these areas that were sprayed, they were also manually eradicated, and they were also part of these other programs of substitution of cultivation. But there are not statistically significant differences around the board. That is what we try to show.
Anderson, thank you very much. And I think you can say that, like you said, the policy stopped in 2015, but that these results are super relevant today because the debate on whether carrying this policy out is still very much in the open and depending on the government. They do it or stop it. So like the results are like very important for them. So right now. So thank you so much.